Someone has once said that they've been let down or knocked down, but God was always there to help them up again. Whenever you think of the children of Israel, and especially their wandering through the wilderness, as you find recorded in the four books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you could say that in many ways they were a people who had been knocked down and knocked back time and time again, and yet the Lord was always there to help them up again. One of the interesting studies I find personally, in my own opinion, in my own Bible study, is the wilderness wanderings of the people of God as they were about to enter into Canaan. Whenever you read through the Psalms, books like Isaiah, other Old Testament prophets, both major and minor, you'll find the wilderness wanderings time and time again being referenced. Sometimes it's explicitly referenced, sometimes it's referenced sort of in a more veiled fashion, but it is one of those great events and occurrences in the Bible that is drawn upon time and time again. Even in the New Testament, there's numerous references to the people of God wandering through the wilderness. And the thing that I love about their wandering through the wilderness, this was the Lord's people, and they very much felt themselves to be isolated or alone. I mean, they were wandering through a desert for 40 years. Undoubtedly, loneliness and that feeling of isolation is there, and it's bound to have been there. But they were never alone. Because you read of the pillar of fire and also the cloud guiding them, leading them each step of the way as they were wandering through the wilderness. And you find this explicitly stated for you in Exodus chapter 13. In Exodus 12, you find the people of God, they're leaving Egypt, they're a blood-bought people. Exodus 12 really is the Passover and all of the incidents there, how they were redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, set free, the firstborn set free by the blood of the Lamb, set free from the bondage and the tyranny and the hardship of Egypt, and they've left Egypt. And now in Exodus chapter 13, they are really on the brink of the wilderness and commencing their wilderness wanderings. And in verse 17 and 18, you have this wonderful reference to the fact that they're not alone. We read there that the Lord led them not by the way of the Philistines, so that it was near, but the way of the wilderness. And the thought there is that they could have gone the short route, the easy route, if they'd just gone through the enemy territory, the Philistine territory, but the Lord didn't lead them that way. As one commentator put it, rather than leading them northwest to the road of the Mediterranean Sea, he led them southeast toward the Red Sea, and of course bipolar opposites there. And the Lord then, whilst he could have taken them the easy way, the easy route through the Philistine territory, enemy territory, and they would have been safe there and they are then gone to the safety of Canaan, yet the Lord took them the long way round. But they weren't alone. Child of God, you can certainly see the parallel, I'm sure, as you think about lockdown and isolation and all that we're going through as a nation, as a country, as a land. There are times when we feel like the children of Israel and we're going round in circles. When you study the wilderness wanderings, you'll discover they essentially went round in circles for 40 years. And yet the Lord led them every step of the way. He was the one giving them the direction, the guidance, his presence and so on. The Lord led them every step of the way. It was the Lord's will for them to aimlessly wander through the wilderness for 40 years. And this is something we constantly need to be reminded of, that this is God's will, this is the Lord's doing, this is a providence of God, this is part of God's permissive will for the world in general and for our little nation here, our little land that we love so much. It is God's will for you as a Christian. Lockdown and all that it brings, this is part of God's will. And yet we're not alone. That's a wonderful thing. When we sojourn, when we wander through this wilderness, and I'm sure if you're anything like me, you would just love it to end tomorrow. You'd love to to take the easy route, as it were, like the children of Israel did with the Philistines. Just a few weeks' journey, really, and they would have been there in Canaan. But it seems we're being taken round in circles with this isolation and lockdown. But it's the Lord's will. But we're not alone, and that's what I want to think about today. And in our little study in isolation here, people of God, they certainly would have felt themselves isolated as well. But they weren't alone. They were not alone. Because they had the pillar leading them every step of the way, the very presence of Christ, right in the midst of them, in the midst of the camp of the people of God, hundreds of thousands of Jews, and yet the Lord was right there in the midst. So I want to think about sojourning with the Lord. And I trust that as you are going through all that you're going through in lockdown, that as you sojourn, as you continue to walk this difficult and hard wilderness experience, that you'll grasp this truth and that the Lord's with you every step of the way. First thing I think we see here is we're thinking about the pillar really going with the people of God as they're isolated, as they're wandering through the wilderness, is the people of this pillar. Verse 18 of chapter 13, and we read that the children of Israel went up harnessed out of the land. The children of Israel. That seems a very, very elementary truth for me to focus on first, but it's very, very important. It was the children of Israel who alone experienced the cloud leading them by day and the fiery pillar by night. In chapter 14, verse 20, we read of the cloud being between the camp of Israel and the Egyptians, and it was darkness to them, but light to the Israelites. And so what I want you to see here is that this pillar, yes, it was leading them, it was guiding them. Whenever it moved, then the people of God, they moved, they followed it. And so it was the one leading them. But what I want you to see here is that it was darkness to the Egyptians. They were looking at the same pillar, or the same fiery cloud, or whatever it might have been at night. They were looking at exactly the same thing, and yet it was as darkness to the Egyptians, but it was light to the people of God. It was something solely reserved then for this blood-bought people. We could say that it was a blood-bought privilege, this presence of Christ. That's really what the pillar was. And that cloud by day was a visible, tangible presence of Christ. He was there with them. They were not alone, but it was solely for them. This was something that the Ammonites didn't enjoy. This was something that the Philistines certainly didn't enjoy. It was as darkness to them. It was an obscure thing. It was a strange thing. It was something very, very different for them. It was darkness, whereas it was light for the people of God. It was a very thing that was leading them and directing them. It was the thing they were depending upon, really. So it was light to them. And we think about the presence of Christ in these New Testament times and in our day and generation, we can say that it is something solely reserved for us as the people of God. The book of Ephesians makes this clear. Ephesians 1:13 tells us that we are sealed with the earnest of his promise, the spirit of promise, the Spirit of God. And when you read the rest of that verse, you'll discover that it is by virtue of the redeeming blood of the Lord Jesus Christ that we have this earnest, or this this down payment. That's the thought there in the original, the thought of a down payment. And really what he's telling us there, Paul, is that we have the Spirit of God, and it's like a foretaste or a down payment of heaven, that which is to come. You make a down payment on your house, you're really obliging that you're going to pay the rest. You make a down payment on a wedding ring or an engagement ring, whatever it might be. You're pledging the rest of the money. And God here is saying that the Spirit of God within the child of God, it's really like a down payment or a pledge of what is to come, face to face with Jesus Christ, present with him. And so, child of God, remember this, that the Spirit of God is something solely reserved for you. The world, like the Egyptians, they look on and we talk about the Lord being with us and so on, and it's darkness to them. It's something they do not enjoy. The little epistle of Jude, and Jude has just one chapter in it, and towards the end of that chapter, Jude 1 verse 19, It speaks of those who have not the Spirit, having not the Spirit of God. The unbeliever. The unbeliever does not have the Spirit. So, child of God, get a hold of this today. An elementary truth, and yet a truth nonetheless that needs to be grasped and cherished and loved. You have the Spirit of promise. That's something that solely is reserved for you as a Christian. The world looks on, and this peace that passes all understanding, the very presence of God, it's something they do not have, and it's something that is darkness to them, but light to you. As the Lord leads you, guides you, directs you through isolation, through lockdown and so on, it's light to you, but it is darkness. The very concept is darkness for the world, to the world around us. So the people of this pillar, I want you then to see secondly the protection from this pillar. In chapter 13 verse 21 we read that the Lord went before them to give them light. In this chapter, as I've said, they're really on the brink of the wilderness. And when you think about it and you look at the geography, you'll discover that the children of Israel, they were surrounded by enemies. North, south, east, west, they were just surrounded by enemies. They had trouble on every side. And yet the wonderful thing about it is that they had this pillar. As I said, it was darkness. It was something that was darkness or black even to the unbeliever looking on, that the Ammonites, the Philistines and so on. It obscured their view. They could not even see, and yet it was light for the people of God. So whenever the pillar, as you know, as it took them through the wilderness, as it up and moved, sometimes it was a day, a week, a month or a year, and then it would move again. What was it doing? It was directing them through the wilderness, but it was also a means of protecting them from the enemy. So whenever he was telling them to move, to go to a certain location, he was actually keeping them out of harm's way. That's what the Lord was doing through the pillar. He was leading them in a safe manner away from the clutches of the enemy. And again, child of God, I say this, that the very presence of God within us is a means of protecting us and you from the enemy. When you think of the enemy, when does the enemy attack? The enemy attacks when we're at our weakest, not our strongest. And so we do need to continue to rely upon the Spirit of God. His strength in him is strength, as the Psalms make it clear, and the Lord is strength. It is in recognizing the strength that is in the Lord and the power of him through the Spirit of God operating in our daily lives, that we are then protected. Yes, the devil, he will attack us undoubtedly, but when we have the Spirit of God and take upon ourselves the armour of God, the Spirit of course being part of that armoury, then we know protection. Whenever we think about the Lord guiding us and directing us, sometimes the Lord takes us a certain way or a certain path. We can't understand it, and yet what's it doing? The Lord is actually protecting you from harm's way, keeping you. You ever thought about that, child of God? Times when the Lord was protecting you and you didn't even realise it. That's what very often would have been the lot for the people of God and the children of Israel. They wouldn't have known maybe that the enemy was waiting on them round the corner or lurking up a hill or whatever, and then the Lord told them to move all of a sudden. And it's the same with us. The Lord, he prompts us, directs us through the Spirit of God, and it is for our good and for our protection. Again, in lockdown, there's much that we do not understand about the movings of God and the promptings of God, providences of God in lockdown. And yet the Spirit of God is prompting you, directing you right the way through this, and it's for your good. Even, dare I say it, for your protection. For your protection. The Lord alone knows what he's keeping you from during lockdown. So the people of this pillar and the protection from this pillar. Lastly, think about the permanence of this pillar. In verse 22 of chapter 13 we read of the Lord that he took not away the pillar. In other words, the pillar, and this is a simple thought but a wonderful truth, the pillar was with them every step of the way. 40 years throughout the wilderness, and the pillar was always there, the cloud by day and the fire by night. Only whenever they entered Canaan, entered rest, was the pillar then removed. And it's the same with you, child of God. As you sojourn through this world, as you go through the wilderness of life, the wilderness experiences of life, as you go through the maras of this world, which is what happened in chapter 14 with the people of God, those bitter experiences. Yet the Lord, He's with you every step of the way until you get to the heavenly Canaan, the heavenly rest. Then it's face to face with Jesus Christ your Saviour, in His very presence. But until then, you have the pillar, God with you every step of the way. So, sojourning with the Lord. I trust that this encourages you this week. Yes, you feel yourself to be in a wilderness, but you're not alone. You're sojourning with the Lord every step of the way.